Part 1. A Life Shattered. The Truth Behind the Poison. It was the middle of the night when I received the call that changed everything. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky, panicked, and barely able to hold it together. Murphy. Murphy's gone. We need to talk. My heart sank, and I didn't know it at the time, but that call was only the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. What followed was a series of events so twisted, so full of betrayal, that it would leave my life in shambles. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, so you can understand how something as simple as my relationship with a family pet, Murphy, ended up pulling me into the darkest chapter of my life. Before I could even process what had happened, I was thrust into a world I never asked to be a part of, a world of deception, heartache, and the kind of cruelty that leaves scars deeper than anything physical. Murphy was no ordinary dog. He was my best friend. He was there for me when no one else was, always by my side through every high and low. When my life felt like it was falling apart, Murphy was the one thing that always made me feel safe. But that safety was ripped away from me in the most horrifying way possible. It all began with a visit to my grandmother's house. A visit that would prove to be far more than just a casual family gathering. I didn't know it then, but it was the start of something terrible. Looking back, there were so many little signs that something wasn't right, but I was too naive to see them. My grandmother, who had always been a bit eccentric, suddenly became overly possessive of Murphy. She started to act like he was her dog. I brushed it off at first. After all, she had always been a little strange. But then, things started to escalate. It wasn't long before Murphy started acting strangely. He became lethargic, disoriented, and I noticed he wasn't eating properly. My heart broke seeing him suffer, but I didn't know what was causing it. I took him to the vet, but the doctors couldn't pinpoint the problem. That's when the police came into the picture, and everything I thought I knew about my family, my grandmother, and even myself came crashing down. The truth came out in the most devastating way. It wasn't an accident. Murphy hadn't just gotten sick. Someone had intentionally poisoned him. Rat poison mixed in with his food, enough to slowly destroy his insides. It was a calculated, deliberate act of cruelty. And the person responsible for it? My own grandmother. The horror of that discovery was enough to send me reeling. How could someone I trusted so deeply, someone who had always been a part of my life, do something so unthinkable? But it didn't stop there. No, this was just the beginning. The authorities were called in, and a full investigation was launched. The police had their suspicions, but they didn't have enough to arrest her right away. But one officer, who had witnessed the whole ordeal when we were searching for Murphy, was certain. And the search that followed would uncover the truth that would destroy my family forever. They found it, hidden in my grandmother's house, the same poison used to kill Murphy. Enough to charge her with animal cruelty. But here's the twist. Even though they found the evidence, even though the case was clear, my grandmother wasn't arrested. She wasn't even held accountable for what she did. Instead, it was left up to the family to deal with the fallout. What came next was something I could never have imagined. The rage, the betrayal, the unimaginable cruelty, it all came crashing down during a seemingly innocent encounter in a local marketplace. It was the last place I thought I would see her, and yet, there she was. My grandmother with that look in her eyes. A look I can only describe as pure evil. She laughed when she asked me, "Did you find your puppy, dear?" There was no remorse, no shame, just a twisted satisfaction. I felt my blood run cold. My mother, who had been trying to hold it together for so long, snapped. She told my grandmother exactly what she thought of her, words that I would never forget. Words that would change everything. That was when the restraining order was put in place. But my grandmother wasn't going to let it end there. She started stalking us, following us wherever we went. It became clear that she wouldn't stop until she had us in her grip again. And that's when we realized that we had to leave. We couldn't stay where we were. The fear, the constant anxiety, it was too much to bear. My family made the decision to move out of state, to get as far away from her as possible. But that wasn't the end of the story either. The fire. The thing that would make everything feel even more real, more terrifying. On Christmas night, our old house, where we had lived for years, was set on fire. It was no accident. Someone had torched it. And as you might have guessed, my grandmother and aunt were involved. But we were ready. My stepfather had set up security cameras around our property, and with the help of a neighbor, we were able to catch the culprits in the act. They didn't know it, but we were always one step ahead of them. Through all of this, I've learned so much about myself, about my family, and about what it means to truly protect those you love. I can't change the past, but I can control what happens next. And the truth is, we're rebuilding. My family is safe now, and we're starting over, stronger than ever. If you want to hear the rest of this story and find out what happened next, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss the full journey through this dark, emotional roller coaster. And trust me, there's more to come. Part 2. The Aftermath, A Family in Ruins. The phone rang just as we were finishing dinner. The sudden shrill of the ringing sound pierced through the air, and I knew something was wrong. It was a late call, the kind of call you only get when something awful has happened. I looked at my mom, whose face drained of color the moment she saw the caller ID. It was our old neighbor. And the words that came next would forever change everything we thought we had left behind. Your old house, it's on fire. I didn't know how to react. The fire, our old home, the one we'd just left behind, the house that held years of memories, both good and bad, was now nothing more than a burning shell. The anger and panic I felt hit me like a wave, but it was more than just shock. It was a gut-wrenching certainty. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. And we all knew who was behind it. It wasn't long before the investigation confirmed what we had already feared. The fire had been set intentionally, and all the signs pointed back to the same people who had haunted us for months, my grandmother and my aunt. They weren't just content with poisoning Murphy or harassing us with their constant stalking. Now, they were willing to destroy everything we had worked for. Our sense of safety, our new life, our fresh start, gone in an instant, reduced to ash by the same people we had once trusted. But let me take you back a little further, before the fire, before everything went up in flames. To understand just how deep this betrayal ran, we have to go back to the beginning, the first crack in the facade, the first sign that things weren't as they seemed. It started with Murphy. The bond one shared with that dog was something I could never fully explain. He wasn't just a pet, he was my emotional anchor. When things at home were hard, when life felt out of control, Murphy was always there to offer me comfort. But that comfort turned into a nightmare when he started to act sick. It wasn't sudden. At first, it was small. He'd skip meals here and there, seem more tired than usual. But I didn't think much of it. Dogs get sick sometimes, right? But as the days wore on, his condition worsened. He was lethargic, disoriented, and the bright spark in his eyes seemed to fade. That's when I took him to the vet. They couldn't figure it out at first. They ran tests, they gave him fluids. But nothing worked. Then, one night, I received the news that would forever haunt me. Murphy was dead. But it wasn't just natural causes. He had been poisoned. The news hit like a truck. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. They told me what kind of poison it was, rat poison, mixed into his food, slowly killing him over time. It was deliberate. It was calculated. And when they ran the investigation, it didn't take long to uncover who had done it. My own grandmother. I couldn't believe it. The woman who had always been a fixture in my life, the one I thought of as my protector, had betrayed me in the most unimaginable way. She had poisoned my dog, my best friend, without a second thought. The very idea felt like a cold slap to the face. How could she do this to me? To Murphy? How could she destroy something so pure, so innocent? But the discovery of the poison was just the beginning of this nightmare. When the police started their investigation, Things quickly spiraled out of control. The tension between my grandmother, my mother, and I became palpable. My grandmother, who always had a way of manipulating people, started playing her games. She tried to twist the truth, turning it around to make herself the victim. She was smart, too smart. She played the role of the frail, innocent old lady to perfection. But I knew better. The police weren't so easily fooled, though. They found the evidence, the poison, the traces of it in her house, the same exact type that had killed Murphy. And while it wasn't enough to arrest her immediately, it was enough to open a full investigation. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part came when we ran into her in the marketplace. It was a normal afternoon, one that should have been uneventful. We were out getting groceries, still reeling from the investigation and the loss of Murphy, trying to start over in a new town. But then we saw her. My grandmother was there, standing by the checkout line. She saw us instantly. The look in her eyes, it wasn't one of surprise or guilt. It was something else entirely. It was pure malice. I can't describe it any other way. The look she gave me could have frozen the air around us. "Did you find your puppy, dear?" she asked, her voice dripping with sickening sweetness. I froze. My blood ran cold. My mother didn't waste a second. She stepped in front of me, her face set in a hard line, and told my grandmother exactly what she thought of her. "Fuck off," she said, her voice loud and unyielding. "We'll make sure you rot in jail for what you did." I thought it was over. I thought that would be the final confrontation, the last words we would exchange with her. But no, my grandmother wasn't done with us. Not by a long shot. Within days, the restraining order was filed. But that didn't stop her. No, she became even more determined to get to us. She started showing up at the end of our street, sitting in her car, watching. We would leave the house, and there she would be, lurking like a shadow, waiting for an opportunity to strike. It became clear, this wasn't just about Murphy anymore. This was about control. She wanted to control us, to make us suffer, and she wasn't going to stop until she had us back under her thumb. And that's when my parents made the decision to leave. We couldn't stay in that house, couldn't stay so close to her. It was too dangerous. We had to go. We moved out of state, into a new house, far away from the people who had caused us so much pain. But that wasn't the end. No, my grandmother's reach extended farther than we had realized. A few weeks after we moved, we found out our old house had been set on fire. Someone had torched it. And as soon as I heard, I knew this was her work. My grandmother and my aunt. They weren't going to let us escape so easily. They wanted to ruin everything we had worked for, everything we were trying to rebuild. But they underestimated us. My stepfather had anticipated something like this. Before we even left, he'd installed security cameras around the house. He had a gut feeling that my grandmother wouldn't just let us go quietly, that she'd try something drastic. Those cameras proved to be our lifeline. They captured everything, the moment the fire started, the figures who had set it. It was all on tape. We didn't just survive, we outsmarted them. My family was finally free, but the scars would remain. This wasn't just a story of betrayal, it was a story of survival, of rising above those who tried to tear us apart. But even now, as I stand on the other side of all this pain, I know one thing for sure, we will never let them win. Part 3. The Road to Healing. Rebuilding a Life Shattered. The days following the fire were nothing short of surreal. We'd escaped the claws of my grandmother's tyranny, but the emotional wreckage was still fresh, still raw. The ashes of our old house weren't just a physical reminder of what we had lost. They felt like the remnants of everything we had ever known. The old life, the old home, the stability we had once taken for granted, gone in a flash, reduced to charred remains. But in the midst of the chaos, I began to realize something. While the fire had destroyed our house, it hadn't destroyed us. My family had endured worse, had survived the worst of what life could throw at us, and we weren't going to let the fire be the end of our story. It was just another chapter in a much larger tale. At first, there were days where we all just felt numb. My mom and stepfather spent hours going through insurance claims, dealing with the aftermath of the fire. My sister was adjusting to the new place, and I was still trying to make sense of everything. The move, the poison, the constant fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were constantly looking over our shoulders, waiting for something worse to happen. But we kept moving forward. It was all we could do. Slowly, the fog began to lift. I found solace in the small, everyday things: the quiet mornings, the peaceful neighborhood, the time spent with my family. We didn't talk about my grandmother much, but the truth of what had happened was always hanging over us like a dark cloud. We couldn't just forget. We couldn't pretend that it hadn't happened. But in a way, I think we were starting to rebuild. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. One of the first steps in our healing process was adopting Diego. After losing Murphy, I never thought I'd be able to love another dog again. Murphy wasn't just a pet to me. He was a constant, a companion, and the idea of opening my heart to another dog seemed impossible. But there was something about Diego's story that spoke to me. He was an older dog, with special needs, something I didn't fully understand at the time, but I soon came to realize just how much he needed care, patience, and love. The moment I saw his adoption tag, it hit me: he has so much love to give. It was as if the universe had placed him in our lives for a reason, as though he was meant to help heal the wounds we had suffered. I wasn't sure at first if I was ready, but Diego's gentle nature and unspoken understanding gave me a sense of peace. He didn't ask questions about my past. He didn't judge me for the scars, the pain. He just loved. And in return, I gave him my heart. It wasn't an instant fix. Healing never is. But Diego became a part of our new life, and slowly, he helped fill the empty space that Murphy had left behind. There were days when I would just sit with him, petting his fur, feeling the warmth of his body next to mine. In those moments, I felt like I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't broken. We were a family, healing together. And that's exactly what we did together. It wasn't all sunshine and roses, of course. The fear of my grandmother never really left. Even though we had moved away, there was always that lingering thought in the back of my mind. What if she found us? What if she came after us again? My stepfather's foresight in setting up the security cameras had given us some peace of mind, but even that couldn't eliminate the constant unease we all felt. My aunt, too, didn't make things easier. After everything that had happened, she still managed to worm her way into our lives, sending me long, rambling messages late at night. The first one came just days after we had moved. It was filled with guilt and blame, with accusations that had no basis in reality. She blamed my mother for the distance between us, accused her of keeping us from her family, and of course, blamed my stepfather. The message was long, too long, really. It was a confusing jumble of her own pain, her own self-pity, and in the middle of it, she once again tried to make herself the victim. She claimed that we had abandoned her, that my mother's actions had destroyed everything. And at the end of the message, she dropped the bomb: "I will never speak to you again." I had to laugh. The sheer hypocrisy of it all. After everything she had done, after the emotional abuse, the tantrums, the manipulation, she was now painting herself as the martyr? It was almost too much to process. But I wasn't going to engage with her. I wasn't going to let her pull me back into her toxic web. I blocked her. And just like that, we were free. Not just physically, but emotionally. My family was healing. We had made it out. We had survived the worst of it, and now we were learning to live again. As the months passed, things slowly started to fall into place. I found a job, nothing glamorous, but it was enough to help support myself, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on my own 2 feet. My mom found work too, and though she was still adjusting to everything that had happened, there was a quiet strength in her that I had never fully appreciated until now. She had been through so much, and yet she never gave up. Her resilience gave me the strength to keep going. My stepfather, too, found his footing. He had been my rock throughout all of this, always calm, always steady, and watching him navigate the difficulties of rebuilding our lives made me realize just how lucky I was to have him by my side. But there was still one more piece of the puzzle: my grandfather. He had been a constant source of support, even when things had been at their worst. He had never wavered in his love for us, and after everything had settled down, he invited us to visit him in the new retirement village he had moved into. It was a strange feeling, walking into that peaceful place where he was now living. But I could see the relief in his eyes. He was finally free of my grandmother's influence. And, for the first time in a long time, I felt like we could all be a family again. We may never be able to fully erase the scars my grandmother left on us, but we had learned something important. No matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried to break us, we were still here. We were still standing. And that's a victory in itself. Our journey wasn't over yet, but it was just beginning. And, for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face whatever came next. Because no matter what, we would do it together. We had survived. And now, we were finally living again. Part 4. The final confrontation. Putting the past behind us. The days had become easier, quieter, and though we were far from perfect, I felt a shift. A new chapter was opening up for my family. Life was still messy, still uncertain at times, but the constant feeling of fear, of waiting for something bad to happen, was starting to fade. We had managed to carve out a space for ourselves where we were free of the shadow my grandmother had cast for so long. And yet, there was still something that gnawed at me. A lingering question that refused to go away. What happened to her? What had become of my grandmother after all the chaos, the fire, the destruction? Where was she now? Was she still out there, planning her next move? I wasn't the only one asking. My mom had her own questions that she had been pushing to the back of her mind, but now they resurfaced with an urgency. After everything she had put us through, after the poison, the threats, the fire, we all needed closure. We needed to know if we could finally walk away completely without looking over our shoulders every time the phone rang or someone knocked at the door. So, my mother did what she had put off for months. She called the police station to ask for an update on her case. What happened to the charges? Was my grandmother still under investigation? The answer came sooner than expected. They had finally arrested her. It wasn't a big surprise. The police had been gathering evidence for months, piecing everything together. But it was a shock to hear the words out loud, "She's in custody." My mind raced. I was both relieved and confused. I thought I had left it all behind, that I could move forward without ever having to confront her again. But now, it seemed, the final confrontation was inevitable. My mom and I discussed it at length. Should we visit her? Should we even give her the satisfaction of seeing us? Could we really walk away from this entire nightmare without closure? There was a part of me that wanted to show her how strong we had become, how we had rebuilt our lives without her. A part of me wanted to look her in the eyes and ask her, "Why? Why did you do this to us?" But another part, perhaps the stronger part, wanted nothing to do with her. I had spent too many years in her grip, too many years questioning my worth because of her manipulation. I wasn't ready to face that again. Ultimately, we decided that my mom would go alone. She had been the one who suffered the most at her hands, enduring years of guilt trips, emotional abuse, and manipulation. If anyone deserved to stand face to face with her, it was my mom. She had been the one to protect me from her, the one who had carried the burden of that toxic relationship for so long. The day my mom went to the police station, I stayed behind. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if this would finally provide the peace I so desperately craved, or if it would just reopen old wounds that had barely started to heal. When my mom came home that afternoon, she was different. Her eyes were tired, but there was a look in them I hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't anger or resentment, but something else, something that felt like a quiet, reluctant release. "She's going to prison," my mom said, sitting down on the couch beside me. Her voice was steady, but I could tell she was holding back something. She had spent so many years carrying the weight of our family's trauma, and now that weight was finally lifting. I asked her why. She continued, her voice soft. I had to know. And you know what she said? I looked at her, waiting. She said, I did it because I was trying to make you love me again. I thought if I could make you suffer, you'd finally come back to me. I thought you'd see me, that I'd be important again. I didn't know how to respond. There was nothing to say, really. For all the years of pain, for all the betrayal, my grandmother's explanation seemed so empty. It was as if she had never truly understood the damage she had caused. It wasn't about love. It was about control, about a twisted need to make everyone bow to her will. And in the end, she had only destroyed herself. My mom sighed deeply, a sound full of years of pent-up frustration. It's over, she said finally. I'm done. We're done. And just like that, it felt like the last piece of the puzzle had finally clicked into place. The anger that had once burned inside me began to fade, replaced by something quieter, something that felt like freedom. We didn't need her anymore. We had been living in her shadow for so long, constantly wondering when she would show up next, when the next bombshell would drop. But now we were free. Not just from her, but from the years of guilt, confusion, and fear she had inflicted on us. And so, with the finality of her arrest, we began to look forward. There was no more looking over our shoulders, no more wondering when the next crisis would hit. My family, though scarred, was beginning to heal. We had found new ground to stand on, new relationships to nurture, and a new sense of peace that I hadn't thought possible. I continued to bond with Diego, our little rescue dog, who had been my companion through the toughest parts of this journey. I learned to love him in a way I hadn't thought I would again. And with him, I learned that love doesn't come from perfection. It comes from healing, from acceptance, from understanding that the scars we carry are a part of who we are, but they don't define us. We started living again. Slowly, but surely, we began to rebuild not just our lives, but our sense of self. We weren't victims of our past anymore. We were survivors. And it was time for us to finally move on. As for my grandmother, well, she had made her choices. She had chosen to destroy the relationships she had once held dear, to manipulate and control until there was nothing left to salvage. She was now facing the consequences of those choices. And I was no longer angry with her. I just felt sad. Sad that she would never understand what she had done to us, to herself, and to the family that had once loved her. But that was no longer my burden to bear. The past was the past, and we were moving forward. Together. And that's what mattered now. Part 5, A New Beginning. Embracing the Future. The days after my grandmother's arrest felt surreal, like we were finally stepping out of a long, dark tunnel. It was as if, for the first time in years, we could breathe again without looking over our shoulders. The relief was overwhelming, but there was also a subtle shift happening inside me, something I hadn't anticipated, a kind of peace. It was like a fog had finally lifted from my heart. We had been living in a constant state of tension, fear, and uncertainty for so long that now, in the absence of all of that, it felt strange. But in a good way. Life, though it had been shattered and upturned, was beginning to find its rhythm again. The sounds of laughter at the dinner table felt more natural, less forced. My sister had started to settle in, spending time with our cousins, and my mom was more relaxed, her shoulders no longer weighed down by the constant burden of trying to shield us from the storm. As for me, the process of healing wasn't linear. Some days were better than others, and sometimes, the weight of the past still felt heavy. But I could feel the change in myself, the way I was beginning to let go of the anger that had once consumed me. There was something liberating in finally releasing the years of resentment I'd harbored toward my grandmother. But even as I let go of that, I didn't forget. The lessons I'd learned, the strength I'd gained, stayed with me. The fire had forced me to confront things I hadn't wanted to face, about myself, about my family, about the kind of person I wanted to become. I had spent too long hiding behind fear, letting the actions of others dictate my future. Now, I knew that I was in control of my own path. The days turned into weeks and weeks into months. My mom and I both found our own footing in this new life. She'd been looking for a job ever since we moved, and after a few interviews, she finally found something. It wasn't the dream job she had once hoped for, but it was something she enjoyed, something that made her feel valued again. I had started looking at universities, something I never thought I'd consider, but now that I felt the weight of my past was lifting, I could see possibilities for the first time in years. Diego continued to be a calming presence in our lives. His goofy smile, his constant need for attention, and the way he would snuggle up to me when I was feeling down reminded me every day of the capacity for love we all still had, despite everything we had been through. He was a reminder that there was still beauty in the world, that no matter how dark things got, love could always find a way in. He was healing us just as much as we were healing him. But perhaps the most significant change came when I found the courage to reach out to my grandfather. He had always been there for me, even when I hadn't fully realized it. I had been hesitant at first, unsure of how to approach him after everything with my grandmother. But one day, as I was sitting on the porch, watching Diego play in the yard, I realized that he was the one person who had never let me down. He wasn't involved in the toxic drama of our family. He was someone who loved us unconditionally, without expectation or manipulation. I picked up the phone and dialed his number. When he answered, his voice was warm and welcoming, as if no time had passed at all. "Hey, Grandpa," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "How are you doing?" He chuckled on the other end. "I'm good, kiddo. Been keeping busy. How about you? How's everything?" For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of relief as I spoke to him. It was like no matter how bad things had gotten, he was still a steady presence in my life. We talked for hours that day, about everything and nothing, and when I told him that I had started looking at universities, he didn't hesitate for a second before telling me how proud he was of me. "I always knew you had it in you," he said. "Just make sure you follow your heart, whatever that looks like. You've got a good head on your shoulders. You'll do great." Those words meant more to me than I think he could ever understand. They were the words of a man who had watched me grow up, who had seen the turmoil in my life, and yet he never once doubted me. It was a moment of clarity for me, a moment that made me realize that the family I needed didn't have to be the one I was born into. It could be the one I built brick by brick, piece by piece, with people who truly cared. After that conversation, I made a decision. I decided to move forward in a way that felt right for me. I wasn't going to let the past dictate who I was anymore. I wasn't going to let my grandmother's toxicity or my aunt's manipulations define my future. I was going to make my own choices, take control of my own destiny. I enrolled in university, something that had seemed so out of reach just months ago. I chose a program that felt right for me, something I was passionate about. I wasn't going to wait for life to come to me. I was going to chase it. It wasn't going to be easy, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I had survived the worst, and now I was ready to live. My mom and I started talking more about our future, and though we both still carried scars, we were finally starting to move forward together. We found our rhythm in the new town, and slowly, we began to make it feel like home. My sister, too, was happier than I had seen her in years, spending time with our cousins, exploring new things, and forging her own path. We had made it through the storm. The past would always be a part of us, but it didn't have to define us. We had weathered the worst, and now we were learning to embrace the future with open arms. And as for my grandmother, I had no idea what the future held for her, but for the first time, I didn't care. She was no longer a part of my life. She had made her choices, and now she would have to face the consequences. But we were done. We were free. I looked at Diego, curled up at my feet, and smiled. It wasn't just a new chapter that we were starting, it was a whole new book. And this time, we were writing it on our own terms. The road to healing had been long and winding, but the most important lesson I had learned was this: No matter how hard the journey, no matter how dark the past, there is always a way forward. The key is to keep going, to keep believing, and to surround yourself with the love and support that truly matters. And now, with my family and my dog by my side, I knew that we had everything we needed to face whatever came next. The future was ours for the taking, and we were ready to seize it. Part 6. The Unseen Strength, What We've Become. As the months went by, I found myself reflecting more and more on how far we had come. The shadows of the past, once so overwhelming, had begun to fade. But the journey, I realized, wasn't just about surviving, it was about becoming stronger than we had ever been. The scars remained, but they weren't the kind that defined us anymore. They were the marks of resilience, reminders of the battles we had fought and won. University life had started, and though I was nervous, there was a sense of excitement too. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving in the direction I had always dreamed of. I was chasing something I had once thought was unattainable, my own future. And with every lecture, every new friend I made, and every step I took toward my goals, I felt myself shedding the layers of fear and uncertainty that had once held me back. It wasn't just the education I was gaining. It was the confidence, the sense of possibility, that came with standing on my own 2 feet. And as I walked through the halls of the university, I could feel my grandmother's shadow shrinking, becoming smaller and smaller, until it was nothing more than a distant echo. The woman who had tried to destroy us, who had tried to break me, no longer had a hold over my life. I was finally free to be who I wanted to be, without the weight of her manipulation or cruelty. My mom was doing well too. The job she had found turned out to be a perfect fit for her. It wasn't just the stability it provided, it was the sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. I could. As for my sister, she had blossomed in a way I hadn't. But amidst all the new beginnings, there were still those quiet moments where the past tried to resurface. The feelings of anger, the disbelief that it had all happened, would sneak in during the quietest times. Those moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, were still heavy. But over time, I learned how to deal with them, to let them come and go without all. One evening, as I was sitting with Diego in the yard, watching the sunset, I realized something important. It wasn't just the past we had survived. It was our own strength, our resilience, and our ability to love that had brought us this far. We hadn't been destroyed by the cruelty that had been thrust upon us. Instead, we had learned from it, and we had used it as the foundation for something stronger, something more meaningful. I could still remember the pain of losing Murphy, the betrayal of seeing my grandmother for what she truly was, but now I could also look at those memories through a different lens. They were no longer just painful moments. They were the catalysts for growth, for transformation. They had shaped me, but they did not define me. In the quiet of that moment, with Diego at my feet and the sky turning orange as the sun set behind the horizon, I finally understood. The strength we had found wasn't just about surviving the worst moments of our lives. It was about becoming better, stronger people because of them. I had learned that strength doesn't come from avoiding the pain or pretending it didn't happen. It comes from acknowledging it, learning from it, and moving forward, taking control of your own narrative. It was in those quiet moments of reflection that I truly realized how much we had healed. We were no longer broken. We were whole, each of us individually and as a family. And it was this realization, this quiet but undeniable truth, that would carry us forward. My grandmother, my aunt, they no longer had the power to take anything from us. They had spent so much time trying to break us, to destroy the love we shared, but in the end, they had only succeeded in strengthening the bond we had with each other. We had made it through the storm. And while the scars would always be there, they were no longer the marks of our defeat. They were the marks of our resilience, of the love that had been the one thing they couldn't touch. And now, as I moved forward in my life, on my own path, away from the past, I knew one thing for sure. The best was yet to come. We had endured the darkest days, and now we were standing in the light, ready to embrace everything the future had to offer. Together, we had built something new, something stronger, something beautiful, and nothing, not even the darkest past, could take that away from us.